Hello and welcome everybody. Welcome to the Tales of the Cocktail seminar titled Digging for Peat. And essentially we are going to be going on a big old deep dive around the beautiful world of peated Scotch whiskey. And I'm very lucky in that I'm joined by, frankly, people who know their stuff when it comes to peated whiskey. So hopefully we'll all get to enjoy their knowledge, their stories, and them kind of me trying to goad them to give as much information as possible about what they do. And hopefully we'll all learn something really interesting about peated whiskey in general, because it is one of the greatest things on earth, frankly. So quick introduction about myself. So I'm a whiskey writer, a tastings host. I also do a lot around combining music, live music and whiskey in various weird and wonderful ways. And yeah, so from there, just a quick introduction. Colin Gordon is the manager of Ardbeg, but previously he was the manager at Lagavulin. And then before that, I believe, spent time at the Port Ellen Maltings on Islay, one of the world capitals of whiskey. Adam Hannett is the head distiller at Barrie, in charge of creating some of the most insane whiskeys on earth, frankly. And then Dr. Rachel Barrie, last but not least, is someone with an insane amount of experience, trained as a chemist at the Scotch Whisky Research Institute, if I remember correctly, Rachel, and then also has worked across so many incredible brands of whiskeys, and these days managing the creation of whiskeys as the master blender at Brown-Forman for Glenglassaugh, Benriach, and Glendronach. So that's a quick introduction. Anything that I've missed that I should cover, gang, before we get started with my very, very brief introductions, or was that okay for all three of you?
That's great.
That was good.
Let's get started. Let's talk about peat.
All right. So what I will quickly do now is I'm going to go over some very quick basics so that everybody watching is on the same page. What I'll also quickly mention is we are doing an exercise in time travel here. We don't know what's happening with the people that are watching, because we're right now recording this in late July. I believe it's September where you're watching, people of the future. Future me is going to be in the chat. So you can ask questions in the chat. Future me, present me for you, will do his best to answer your questions as well. Some of the panel may be on the chat as well to help answer questions, but I certainly will be there. So feel free to put questions in the chat of anything that we're covering today, and I'll do my best to answer. With that, a quick run through. I'm going to quickly go over how you make malt whiskey. Then I'll quickly go over kind of the basic explanation of how you create peated whiskey, and then we'll go from there, and I'm going to start lobbing questions at our incredible panel. So how you make whiskey. This is the very, very quick explanation. Whiskey is distilled beer. You take some beer, you extract and concentrate the alcohol, stick the resulting clear vodka-like spirit, which is called new make spirit, put it in a cask for a few years, and then you've got whiskey, and somehow it's magical and delicious and beautiful. Now, to go into a little bit more detail, when you're creating that beer, we're talking about malt whiskey, which means you have to use malted barley. Scotch malt whiskey is 100% malted barley. It's not like with bourbon where you can mix up your grains and have different mash bills. There's only one mash bill with malt Scotch whiskey, 100% malted barley. And when you are malting that barley, you soak in water so it germinates and releases the sugars that eventually become your alcohol. Then you dry it, then you mill it into a rough flour, and then you add a bunch of water and yeast to make your whiskey beer, which is called the wash in technical terms. And then you're going to distill that and put that in the cask. So that's the whiskey production process, normally delivered in over an hour at a distillery tour. And I've just done it over the internet in 30 seconds, something like that. Hope that was clear. Now, when you're creating peated whiskey, peat is spelled P-E-A-T. Peat are mosses and plants that have been decomposing for tens of thousands of years without any oxygen. When you dig it out of the ground, it looks kind of like a weird mud. When you dry it, you can light it on fire. Peat is the ancient fuel source of Celtic tribes. When you want to create a peated whiskey, the usual method, shall we say, is when you've got your barley that is malting, you're soaking it in water so it germinates, and then you're drying it. You'll take a hunk of peat, stick it in an oven called a kiln, and then you're going to burn the peat and use the smoke to help dry the barley. The smoke will stick to the barley, and this is what impregnates the whiskey with meaty, medicinal, smoky aromas and flavors, and plenty other incredible aromas and flavors as well that ends up in your final peated whiskey. That was my very rapid explanation of peat basics. I'm going to pick on one of our panelists and go with Mr. Colin Gordon because he spent time at Port Ellen Maltings. How was my explanation? Anything that you feel I should quickly add or that you feel should be added to that very, very, very rapid run through?
I think it was a fine rapid run through, Felipe. I think that's okay.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. So glad to hear you managed to get through that. Okay. So with that, let's get to grips with what's going on. So what I'm going to do is I'll start with a question that has started to come up and spent some time being discussed in the whiskey world and the whiskey community. And for a long time, people were talking about this idea of, I'll call it terroir. So this idea that region matters in the production of whiskey, and different people have taken different sides to it. There's been all kinds of debate. There's been debate about whether the concepts that apply to wine should also apply to whiskey, et cetera, et cetera. But then part of that debate did center to an extent on peat and whether the region where peat comes from matters. So let's kick off with that. And I'll go to Mr. Adam Hannett because Bruichladdich have done some incredible work around focusing on using local barley and local ingredients to create a amazing whiskey. Adam, because I think Bruichladdich doesn't use Islay peat, if I remember correctly, but does the region where the peat is dug from matter?
Well, hi, Felipe. Yeah, I do believe it does in a nutshell. As you rightly pointed out, at Bruichladdich, we've been looking into the concept of terroir through a lot of different kind of lenses, if you like, in what we do with making whiskey. Primarily, that's the barley growing and where that's grown, and the different kind of varieties or cultivars that we've been using over the years. You're right in what you say about the peat. So at Bruichladdich Distillery, we make Bruichladdich whiskey, which is unpeated, which is unusual for Islay malts. We also make a whiskey called Port Charlotte, which is heavily peated. I don't know if we want to start kicking into ppms just now, but if we say Port Charlotte's around about 40 ppms, and there's a phenol content in the malt. And Octomore, which is unusual because Octomore doesn't have a specific ppm. It's always a minimum of 80 and can be anything above. And I'm sure we can talk about that in more detail later. But when we are getting the malt, as you again go back to your fantastic explanation of how whiskey's made during that malting process, that's not done here at the distillery or on Islay for us. That's done by Beds Maltings up in Inverness, and they're using peat from Aberdeenshire, which will have a different, or will give a different kind of phenolic profile into the malt than an Islay peat. And it's something that we, in terms of exploring that, I can say that, I can believe that. I think it would make a huge difference. I think everything we've discovered with terroir, all these kind of very small details, you can go down different roads to create different flavors in whiskey. And I absolutely believe that terroir, the peat, the kind of the makeup of that peat makes a huge difference in phenols and flavors you'll get through in the malting. And at the moment, all our malt is done in Inverness. We're working at the moment on a plan to build our own maltings on the island. So just still in the kind of the design kind of phase of all that. But hopefully with that, we'll be able to explore Islay peat and mainland peat and be able to kind of really demonstrate that over a longer period. Where we have done a very small amount of Islay peat in our process to kind of test this before. We did find that with the Islay peat that we were using, it didn't give us the high levels of phenols we were getting from the mainland peat, which is quite interesting. So that's just from 1 year where we tried it maybe 9 or 10 years ago. So quite exciting to be able to, in the coming years, put that into practice to really explore that in a lot more detail in that typical Bruichladdich fashion.
Excellent. So could you talk a little bit more about, because, Islay's got this thing of like, oh, the Islay whiskeys taste like X, Y, and Z. That's a kind of a common, let's say, a myth that comes up quite regularly, given that there's such a wide variety of Islay whiskeys and the flavors that are produced on the island, especially since you're not necessarily using peat from the island for a lot of these distilleries. What then is the nature of the peat smoke in both Port Charlotte and Octomore, or is it better to simply separate the two and talk about the nature of the peat smoke in Port Charlotte and the nature of the peat smoke in Octomore that you aim to achieve across those two brands?
Well, yeah, it's quite interesting when you kind of think about the history of kind of Bruichladdich and that kind of peating process, because Bruichladdich Bruichladdich was kind of open and closed periodically through the through the years. Most recently, it closed in 1994, reopened again in 2001, as you know, and a bit more of a independent, or it was an independent distillery, and certainly an independent mindset. And Bruichladdich was unusual because back in the early 60s, like all Islay whiskies, or up until 1960s, it was producing a heavily peated whiskey, we believe. When the 60s come, the demand for whatever blend Bruichladdich was going into was unpeated, so we stopped malting here. We stopped using heavily peated in Islay, which was unusual for Islay that we were unpeated. So when we reopened in 2001, independent mindset, we wanted to really discover what that peated flavour was like, because Bruichladdich is quite a light, kind of elegant style. We've got very tall, thin stills, which gives us a kind of gentle, elegant, floral style in our spirit. And what we decided with Port Charlotte was let's look back and see what that was like. You know, with that lovely kind of elegant distillation with that heavy peat. We went with about 40 ppm for that, which is, I think, a good average for kind of a high average for the other Islay distilleries, to get us a bit of that flavour profile, a traditional kind of Islay profile. And what we discovered was that elegance and that peat smoke worked peacefully together. And then we went into kind of that typical thing we do, where let's push it a bit, let's see what we can do. What happens if you really, really heavily peat barley? So working with Baird's malt up in Inverness, we just asked for the most heavily peated they could produce, and got into the discussing their kind of their technique of heavily peating the barley or the malt, sorry. And they could achieve very, very high phenol levels, and so we tried it, and it was really, we didn't set out to achieve anything in particular in terms of a flavour profile. It was really just exploratory, and what we discovered that with Port Charlotte, we get this kind of again, we retain that elegance. With Bruichladdich, Port Charlotte and Octomore, we're looking to distill it the same way. We're not changing the cup. We're still looking at that elegance and that quality in the spirit. And we just see where the peat smoke comes through. So so it's quite an interesting way of looking at it. We don't set out to actually, particularly Octomore, which is super heavy peated, we don't set out to necessarily produce it as the most heavily. We could change our distillation to the cuts and get more peat through. We just want to see where it fits in. And I suppose when you think about what we're doing in the last 20 years isn't a lot of time in the whiskey industry. So we're still kind of, I suppose, with Port Charlotte really establishing, that kind of style. It's certainly with Octomore, it's very exploratory, and by the nature of Octomore, we're not getting a specific phenol content each time. A set phenol content. It is what it is. As long as it's over 80, we'll call it Octomore. So we'll have everything from 80 up to 309 ppm was one of the highest we've actually achieved. So we can, it's quite an interesting way of thinking about whiskies. We certainly don't set out to achieve something. I think it's very exploratory. I think what we.
Yeah, absolutely superb. And you've already introduced so many of the concepts that I want to try and address as deeply as possible in a short space of time. And what I'm actually going to do, Adam, I'm going to seize on some things you said there, and I'm going to kick the ball over to Rachel, if this is okay. Because, so Adam, you were talking about the nature of the Bruichladdich spirit and how it takes the different experiments that you're doing. Rachel, you've worked for so many different whiskey brands, including many peated whiskey brands. And like Bruichladdich at Ben Riach, you're also doing both unpeated and peated. Could you kind of talk a little bit about the things that you wrestle with or maybe wrestling is the wrong word, but I'm going to stick with that word, when looking to differentiate between peated Ben Riach and unpeated Ben Riach? What Adam also did, which I should have asked him to do, but he just did it naturally, is could you talk a little bit about the actual nature of Ben Riach and what it's like as kind of a whiskey, just for that people watching as well, because it isn't all the distilleries you guys work for are mind-blowingly awesome. And then the final thing I'm going to ask you, Rachel, especially because of your chemistry background, Adam was talking about phenols. Now, people who know a bit about whiskey and peated whiskey know what those are, but Rachel, could you actually give a quick explanation as well about what phenols exactly do to peated whiskey and what they mean to the aromas and flavors of peated whiskey? And I realize I just threw a lot at your doorstep.
Let's start with the first one. Well, Benriach is in Speyside, so quite different from Adam and Colin, both distillers and Islay. And Benriach, in the heart of Speyside, actually has its own maltings. And going back in time to 1898, the malt it used would have been peated. And throughout its existence, it has produced peated malt. It has used peated malt. Actually, between 1900 and 1966, the distillery was closed, but the maltings was used to supply the rest of the industry in the area. And it really was in the 1970s when most of the Speyside malts really became unpeated because of North Sea gas coming in to then fuel the fire. But Benriach continued doing peated batches, continued distilling peated spirit from the peat that was in the locality in the north of Scotland, from the barley that was within a 50-mile radius, and malted locally as well. So everything in terms of terroir was there with Benriach then, and continues to this day local to the area. So that's really, really important. In terms of the different styles, we think, Benriach has a world of flavor. It has the beautiful opposites, I suppose, the tension in a good way, the collision of one of the most fruity, orchard fruit laden spirits in Scotland, that's very delicate, very pure. And then also the use of smoke in our smoke season. So we peat our spirit just for one period of the year. And this year, this is going to be in September and October. So the months, in the autumn months, we have our smoke season. So that's when you go to the distillery, it smells like a barbecue in a forest. You can smell all the really sweet, smoky smells. The rest of the year, it's a classic style. And to make Benriach, again, what's quite different from the Islay malts, I think, and we've not mentioned it yet, is the water. So it's very mineral rich. Unlike the water on Islay, it's very mineral rich. And, that also has an influence during maltings and also during the process to make a very, very fruity spirit. What's also different from most other distilleries, I can't think of any that do this, is that we've got a 4-water mash. So that's when the hot water is added to the grist, the milled malt, and it then extracts the sugars. And we do this over 4 different waters. So it's a very gentle process. And what that means is that it locks more of the fruit and more that's in the husk of the barley. And in the husk of the barley, that's where you find your phenols. And that's where you find the citrus elements, the citrus fruits as well. So in the classic, we're going to get more of that through the citrus fruits. It's going to add to the orchard fruits and fermentation and give us this fruit bomb of the still. And when we peat in the smoky season, that's going to give us this smoky fruit bomb of the still. Also, when we peat, it's 45 parts per million. And this is about the same as Laphroaig, Lagavulin. And, if they were to source peat from the mainland, it would be at that level, for example. But all our peat, as I say, comes from the north of Scotland, as does the barley. So it's very, very true to the origins back in the early 19th century. And throughout, it's never changed in that way. When we distill, another key point of difference is that unlike some distilleries have a very long foreshots at the start of the distillation, this is the bit that they cut out. We've got a very short foreshots that we cut off at 11 minutes and 13 minutes, sorry, for Benriach. And this means that we capture a whole rainbow spectrum of fruit. And as well as in the smoke season, we go 1% alcohol deeper into the cut. So instead of cutting at 61% for the classic spirit, we cut at 60%, but we keep the foreshots the same. And what this means is we get a little bit more coming through towards the end of distillation from the peat influence. But what I'm looking for is a balance of the fruit and the malt and the smoke to then mature in oak casks to get the added layers of oak. And getting that balance right. But the beauty of having a smoke season, we've also got a triple distilled season in the summer, and we've got a malting season at our own maltings, which happens in the spring. So this means that, you know, I've just got this world of flavor to work with, the casks maturing from each individual type of spirit, and then I can decide how to bring it all together to make the flavors collide, intertwine, combine, to create a beautifully balanced portfolio. As because we have the classic 10 and 12-year-old, we also have a smoky 10 and 12-year-old as well. And then just let people try it for themselves, you know. I think I've answered the first two questions. Please jump in if I haven't.
No, that pretty much covers it beautifully. But could you, I was asking also if you could also provide a quick explanation of just what are phenols and kind of do they do in whiskey? A 101 lesson.
Okay. Well, I've got a lump of peat here, so I might as well show you. It's not very attractive, but it's clearly, you know, it's not quite, it's like baby coal, let's call it that. You know, this is about 10,000 years old. And to make coal in the northeast of Scotland, we also have coal, but that you need to add another tens of thousands of years onto that to transform into coal. So basically, in this particular lump of peat, this is Highland peat. So this is the peat that we use in Barrie. And you can see there's actually a lot of material that fibrous material that has come from the coniferous greenlands, the pine forests of the Caledonian forest, and has broken down over 10,000 years. So what does that mean? Well, when this gets burned, so when this goes in the fire, you can see a wood burning fire behind me. If I was to put this on the fire and it was to burn, this would release lots of sweet aromatic smoke, because these fibers here are made up of what we call lignins. So plant materials, typically lignins and cellulose, hemicellulose, and the trees and the various different vegetation. And depending on that composition, when it's burned, that breaks down the polymeric structures into smaller molecules. And the smallest molecule you can go with the lignin structure is phenol. So, phenol is the individual molecule that is the smallest. You also have lots of branch chain phenols, which are the glycols, the cresols, and these are the ones that actually give you the most flavor. Phenol itself has an odor threshold of like 50 parts per million. You know, few people can actually pick it up, but it's the smaller molecules, the ethyl glycol, that's a bit like cloves, the methyl glycol, actually a little bit more like, it's a bit more like sweet vanilla, actually. And then you get the whole spectrum. So depending on your peat, you're going to get a different spectrum of the cresols, which give you the more medicinal type aromatics, and the glycols, all of which have very low odor thresholds compared to phenol. So it depends how it's broken down, the influence of the particular conditions, how wet it is, how dry it is, etc., when it's then thrown on the fire. And that spectrum will define the characteristic of the peated malted barley when it has been malted. However, when it then goes into the distillery, that's when things can change again and transform again, because the distillery itself, depending on its water, depending on its mashing conditions, depending on fermentation, but most so distillation with the cut points, will select, just like we're selecting different fruits during distillation, you can also select different phenols depending on the distillation as well. So So that's some of the process related. And obviously I've mentioned Highland peat. If this were Isla peat, it would be a different composition, because you'd obviously have more influence from the sea, from the brine, a lot more briny, acidic water conditions than in the northeast, and therefore a slightly different spectrum as well.
Amazing. That was awesome. Rachel, thank you so much. And that was a thorough dive there. So I am now going to kick the can down the road to Mr. Colin Gordon. So Colin, Rachel just provided such a superb sort of breakdown of kind of how essentially what's going to happen to the peat as it gets processed. The way I like to think of peat, which I feel is not explained enough, is that for me, the art of creating peated whiskey, kind of how Rachel explained it, is the art of controlling the loss of the particles that provide smoky aromas and flavors, because you're going to lose it throughout the process. I wrote an article about peated whiskey a while ago, and I got the opportunity to interview both you and Adam about it. You told me about the different ways in which you can lose phenols, both let's say accidentally and on purpose, to create certain profiles. And you worked at the Port Ellen maltings. I mean, you were processing loads of peat there. So could you talk a little bit about the kinds of things that you as a maltster had to think about, and then also how it applies to Ardbeg?
Yeah, of course. No, I know it's really interesting. That's really interesting, just sitting listening day to day when you work with peat. It's good just to hear other people's thoughts and how it impacts. I think one of the greatest thing about the industry is we all use 3 ingredients, or 4 if you include peat, and the range of flavors and tastes we get, it's just absolutely incredible. So the maltings, when I was at the maltings, I suppose when you work at a distillery or a maltings, the pressure always fell on the maltster, because you would have to meet the spec that the distilleries require. It's nice now to be sitting in this seat and just ordering it and not having to worry too much about that. But there were lots of challenges to meet the phenols and the phenol spec that came in from distilleries, because barley itself, there was work done like a number of years ago by a chap that ran the maltings. He's retired now, a guy from Diageo called John Thompson, and he felt he did a fair bit of research around grain size, and he felt that phenols actually, you tend to get higher phenols with smaller grain size. Clearly, as the industry looks for yield, we want big bulky grains, so it's become more challenging, if you like, to constantly meet the phenol specs when you've got bigger bulky grains. It's if you had more smaller grains, more surface area to pick up the phenol. So even right from the start, the grain, it can be quite challenging. But one of the things we always looked for down there was the quality of peat itself. As Rach was talking about the moisture, if your moisture content in the peat bank is way up over 80%, that peat is then laid out to dry for a couple of weeks, get it down to say 55% before you bring it in. And the clear thing you're going to want is when you're burning peat is that you don't get flame. You don't want to see flares coming through the peat when it was burnt at the malting. So it had to be very controlled. So the heat was always provided by the burner in the kiln, and the peat was just there to provide the smoke. So you almost want it to keep the flames died right back, wetting the peats and keeping it under control to stop the flare up, to really get intense smoke. And that was the way you could always try and meet the requirement. And at Port Ellen Maltings at the time, if a kiln cycle took about 30 hours, about 16 hours of that was peating. If you had wet peats fresh in from the moss, you maybe didn't need to peat for quite as long as that, maybe 13, 14 hours. If you came to the winter, you've got a shed full of dry peat, it would become really, really challenging to try and keep the fires burning well and smoking, because the drier that peat got, it almost has the conditions of burning logs, it starts flaring too much. So there were loads and loads of challenges about burning peat, and you need to be as efficient as you can as well, of course, because it's a carbon store, and it's a hugely important part of what we do. But you need to be efficient with the peat so that we're not wasting a valuable resource. But the other thing that we always kept an eye on at the time was the moisture of your green malt. So your malt just before kilning, If that was too dry, so again, well, the weather we've had on Islay recently, very, very challenging with some of the temperatures we've seen. So if you're germinating in the drums, things and your humidification's not working as well, that green malt, you really want it 44 to 46% moisture. If that's getting a bit low, you'll find your phenols didn't stick as well to the husk. So lots and lots of challenges. That when we bring it in here at Ardbeg, it's very heavily peated malt. We bring up 55 ppm. But the key things that Rachel touched upon there, of course, is your cut points. You're always going to lose phenol right through milling, mashing, fermentation, masses in distillation, and in maturation as well. So we lose lots of phenol even right out in the draft. So the draft that goes out to farms around here is, you can smell it, it's peaty because there's still phenol residue in the husk. But the key thing really is the cut point. Ardbeg, we have Dave Broom once described it as soup and fruit. I always think it's a great way to describe Ardbeg with the purifier that we have. We get lots of lovely fruity notes in the whiskey that we have. It's very heavily peated malt, and we quite similar as well. Take quite a quick 4-shot cut, so we get lots of that like really aromatic, solventy, that really big fruity note, esters, and the way we run our stills is we cut down at 20 degrees, we're at 62.5. We cut off onto faints at, so we're capturing a lot of that. Why there could be other distilleries where if they take a higher cut point, thinking of another one on Islay that cuts onto faints quicker than that, you get a much lighter spirit. It's similar as well, obviously, to the still shapes and the dynamics of the stills. If you've got short, dumpy stills, you're going to get a lot more of the phenolics. But the phenolics, because most of the phenols is at the end of the run, it's in the faints. That's where you're going to capture a lot of it. But you have to clearly be careful that you're not getting greedy, and you don't want to be capturing unwanted notes or fainty notes in your spirit.
Superb. So to go on from that, to go on to when you were talking about at the beginning there about wrestling with the peat, I'm using that word wrestling again. So whether you're getting dry peat, wet peat, you got different grains, they absorb the peat differently. My question for you here is the conditions in which you have to, when you're dealing with different conditions of peat or different conditions of barley, is there going to be a difference in flavor at the end of the whole whiskey making process? So if you're using particularly wet peat and having to process that, is that going to lead to certain flavors and aromas at the end? Or conversely, dry peat, or just in the way the moisture content will vary between peat and barley? Will that lead to certain things at the end? Or is it just more about controlling things as best as possible to get the desired smoke and phenols from that malting process? Yeah, because the way that phenol was always measured was on like a colorimetric analysis, and that's only going to give you, if you like, your total phenol. But like again, Rachel was saying, there's so many different varieties of like flavor compounds that comes from burning peat. Unless you run it through HPLC or gas chromatography, or you really map out, you're not going to break down individually the components from every time you burn the peat. But the key thing was to look for the overall balance, to look for that magic figure of ppm, which distilleries would order to try and make sure that that spec was met. You wouldn't so much get different flavour characteristics. I don't feel anyway. I've told you before, Felipe, I'm a whiskey romantic. I very much come from a chain of thought where, terroir and local peat, they are all different. But there's something to be said by the time you've taken that malt, you've milled it, mashed it, fermented it, distilled it, and matured it, it's probably going to be pretty difficult to detect on the nose or the palate in terms of the differences. So there were real challenges around using things like dry peat, was just keeping the fires under control, or very, very wet peat, getting the fires going. But I wouldn't have said it affected the flavour or the overall finish of the product or your unique spirit. It was more just about making sure it was consistent. Amazing. Thank you so much. Just realized I was talking when I was on mute there. That's awesome. Colin, thank you so much. So then to go further, to talk about how the differences in distillation can lead to such radical differences in the peat that will come through the final whiskey product. Before Ardbeg, you were at Lagavulin. Could you give us a quick overview of the differences between Ardbeg and Lagavulin in the nature that they distill and what the results are from that, given that those distillers are just right next to each other, but it almost in a way doesn't matter given that they're so different to each other in a way as well.
Yeah, I think the malt specs were obviously different. We do take higher phenols in the malt here at Ardbeg. I would say that the biggest differences were, again, similar fermentation times. The biggest differences really in the distillation. We have we've got pretty good sized stills here at Ardbeg. The purifier on the spirit stills, on the line arm or the lag pipe coming out of the spirit stills. I say spirit stills because we've now got two. We only had one up to about 6 months ago. So when you're running your spirit stills, you increase the amount of reflux because you're starting to condense in the lag pipe back down the purifier and into the still, and you get a really pronounced estery note. You really get big fruity notes. Lagavulin definitely has that as well, but I think at Ardbeg it's more pronounced. I think that fruity thing. I think almost in some of the new makers there's almost like a menthol note, like a background note, and I think that's often to do with just the purifying the amount of reflux that's encouraged in the spirit stills. What was slightly different at Lagavulin is big tall wash stills and a lie pipe or a line arm that just went slightly up at an angle to encourage reflux. Then they had sort of smaller pear-shaped, I don't want to say dumpy stills, but they were smaller, the spirit stills, yet they were run very, very slowly. So you can try and encourage reflux, but with small stills. So you got this real balance of notes that were taking over the spirit stills into the condenser.
Colin, I'm so sorry. Can I interrupt you quickly, just again, so that everybody watching is on the same page? You've talked about reflux, and it's so important in distillation. Can you briefly explain what exactly that is?
Well, your copper strips unwanted characteristics from spirit, sulfites and sulfury notes. So if you distilled in stainless steel, you would get a pretty horrible spirit coming across, sulfury and eggy and not very nice. So with copper, as you're distilling, you're actually stripping copper from the inside of the still every single time, and it's interacting with the spirit, removing these unwanted characteristics. And the more copper contact you have, or copper conversation as it's sometimes called, it encourages lighter notes. So when we talk about reflux, it's about how much, if you like, is condensing and falling back into the still rather than going over into the lag pipe to be condensed. It's about how much, if you like, is going up, falling back down, and the more of that reflux you can encourage, the more copper contact potentially that you'll get rid of the sort of lighter, fruitier characteristics, rather than if you have sort of shorter stills and everything's going over, or worm coils where you're getting a quick condensing, and you tend to promote more heavy characteristics and sulfury notes.
Yeah. Colin, apologies so much for interrupting you, but thank you so much for the clarification. Okay. We're talking about Lagavulin. If I could put you back onto Lagavulin.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say they have this balance there where, they're sort of shorter stills than we have at Ardbeg, but they run slower. Although our total run time for the spirit stills is about 8 hours. Lagavulin, when I was there, was longer, 11 and a half hours. So it's these slight differences, if you like, between the sites. Even though the malt, there's probably 10 ppm of a difference between what's being brought in, the whiskies are noticeably different in the new make as well. So obviously you're going to lose a lot of that distillery character through maturation, especially with active casks and a longer maturation. But it's very, very noticeable in the new make how different they are, and that's part of the magic of the industry we work in. It's these slight differences, stills, the way they run, charge volumes, etc. That you get a completely different product at the end.
Awesome. Well, then let's continue on that theme, because if we're talking about the nature of how peated flavors or phenols are lost in maturation, I'm going to have to go back to Rachel. So for you, Rachel, when you're dealing with your stock and feel free to bring in your past work, but just focusing on Benriach, let's say, how does peated Benriach change over time in the cask, and how does it change over time across the different styles of casks that you have?
Yeah, great question. Again, you know, the key difference here is in the spirit character before it goes to mature. With the smoky whiskey for Benriach, I really want to just emphasize how different it is from other distilleries, because it's such a sweet smoke. So just to give you an idea, I mean, you can see all these logs behind me, and I've held up the piece of peat. But from this peat, I mentioned when this breaks down, this lignin, I forgot to say that actually this releases vanilla as well. You might not know this, but vanilla is obviously one of the most ubiquitous flavor compounds in the world. It's in mother's milk. It's, you know, it's something everyone loves. But it also is a phenolic aldehyde. Who'd believe it? That comes from wood when it's burned. So when the wood is charred and toasted, it releases a lot more vanilla from the lignin. And in the Highland peat in particular, we get vanilla actually coming from the husk of the barley and also from the lignin that breaks down from the Caledonian forest over 10,000 years. So there's a lot of synchronicities here. I think that's what I'm trying to say. And I just wanted to emphasize that point even before it goes into an oak cask, that we have really sweet spirits. You know, it's almost like Demerara peat, if you want to say. It's almost got this sort of sweet, sugary character to it. And then the 4-water mash again, you know, really concentrates up that sweetness, and the stills concentrate up all the orchard fruit. So Benriach is very true and very authentic to its terroir. Everything about it. And our casks are matured at the distillery in Speyside, and again that has an influence as well. You know, it's quite dry actually in Benriach. I think we've got about the same rainfall as Barcelona, for example, whereas you know, about 600 millimeters per year, whereas Islay has about 2,500 millimeters per year. So you've got these kind of differences during the maturation process in the environment as well in which the spirit is warehoused. So you've got that terroir influence, or air, I suppose, the influence of the air. But then you've got the different types of casks. And this is where it really gets fun. And this is where I have the most fun, because the spirit of the still is like a smoky fruit bomb. You know, as we don't cut too far into distillation and we've got the short spirit cut, it's very clean. So we capture the very clean phenols. So you're getting the sweet smoke, but you're not getting any of the harsh, acrid notes. So sometimes you get ashy notes that come through if you go deeper into the cut from the cereal, whereas ours are really sweet. So we start with this base of smoke that almost is already like wood smoke, if that makes sense. So if you can imagine that, so we have a concentration of the still, it goes into a bourbon cask that's charred and toasted, probably an ex-Jack Daniels cask with a medium char, medium toast, filled with Jack Daniels first, and then with Benriach. And in that bourbon cask, you know, we're going to get lots more vanilla. There's actually going to be some phenols added, and you know, it really frustrates me when I hear people say, "Oh, the phenols reduce with maturation." Actually, if you measure on a chromatograph, they actually increase. What is reducing is the perception of the cereal gristy character of peat. That is reducing because that gets subtracted and it reacts with the cask and as the cask breathes. So you actually, from the char layer in the bourbon cask, you're getting a few more phenols. Just as I say, it's been charred, a bit like burning that lump of peat, putting the cask over an open fire. So you're getting more phenols coming through. So you're getting more sweetness, the sweet phenolic aldehydes. And what the Charlier also does is it subtracts out any of the cereal, harsher notes that you might find in the spirit, not Benriach, but maybe in other distilleries. So we find with Benriach, it's so clean. I mean, literally, it's a delicate genius. It will just pick up different flavors. It will harmonize, collide, intertwine, combine with the different flavors from the cask. So, in a smoky, this particular one here is Benriach 21 years old. So it's a good one to talk about aging and maturation with, because lots happen in maturation. Over 21 years, Benriach actually, it breathes in the beautifully pure, clear air of Speyside. It lifts the flavors. And in this one, we have, about 30% of the recipe is actually our smoke season. The other 70% is our classic style. But over time, it really mellows and it becomes more elegant. So, you start with this smoky fruit bomb off the still, and over time in different casks, it mellows and becomes a richer smoke, a richer, fruitier smoke, more esterification from the oak as well. And then it becomes, by 21 years, I would say it becomes a more elegant smoke. It becomes almost more pine-like, like you're actually standing in the Caledonian forest. So it mellows with age, I would say, rather than reduces. And of course, all the other flavors are changing at the same time. It's really, really complex, lots going on. And actually, over time, it's going to become more tropical as well, because some of the compounds in there are then going to further esterify and give you more tropical fruit. So sometimes the smoke can actually can amplify some of the fruit notes as well. So our smoky 10-year-old is like smoked applewood. And it is really sweet and Demerara sugar, mature the smoky whiskey in rum barrels from Jamaica and vanilla, and also in virgin oak, where it works really, really well because you're giving more of that vanilla from the virgin oak and caramelization sweetness. So I would say Benriach is probably more the dessert side of smoke. So if you think of a smoky barbecue or a smoky dessert, that's really the Benriach style, and over age it just becomes more elegant and enriched. Yeah, that's probably the easiest way to put it.
So Rachel, that was awesome, because you're the first person to compare whiskey and the compounds found in whiskey with mother's milk, which means that we're in a way all biologically wired to drink whiskey. I'm going to kick it over to Adam, because Adam, you produce the peatiest whiskey in the world, so we have to talk about it if we're talking about peated whiskey in a seminar, right? So I guess my question to you, especially going into all the things Rachel was talking about with the maturation, the effects of the maturation, what things can happen over time. You've got Port Charlotte, heavily peated. You've got Octomore, blow your mind. Depending on the Octomore release, it may turn into either a baby dragon or a full-grown dragon because of the peat. So when you were taking your new make spirit, how do you approach the way you're going to mature your Port Charlotte compared to the way you're going to approach your Octomore?
That's a really, really good question, actually. And before I answer, I just want to say how interesting it is, and like really a privilege to listen to Rachel and Colin talking. I'm learning so much. I'm taking so many notes, because I suppose our approach at Bruichladdich is a lot kind of less scientific, if you like. A lot of it's particularly, I suppose, coming from the independent kind of way of doing things and kind of making our own kind of way in the world, if you like. Back in the day was it was really just exploring and trying things ourselves, and we don't necessarily have the we don't keep ourselves awake at night worrying about the the kind of scientific side of things, which is more done by kind of that feel and the instinct, and I think that's maybe led to a lot of that conversation around Octomore being super heavy peated and it all being about the phenols and the numbers. And I think what we've kind of all been talking about in various ways in this conversation is that, we can focus on the phenols and we can focus on the peat, but it has to be in the context of the whole process. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense by itself. There's so many different aspects of the process that are going to influence that final flavour. So I think that's really important to kind of put in place. With Port Charlotte, I think there's always been a really special kind of place with Port Charlotte, because it was, when the distillery reopened, it was the first whiskey we made. It was heavily peated, the traditional Islay style. It's always felt like that's the kind of traditional identity of Bruichladdich, as beautiful and elegant as Bruichladdich is. With Port Charlotte, we've always been laying down stocks looking for a little bit more age in there. So we currently have a 10-year-old as a core product, and there's something about that new spirit when we take it off the still. Again, because everyone's been talking about the shape of the still and the style of distillation. We don't have a big charge in the stills, very, very tall thin necks. We again get a lot of reflux. We really encourage that through that slow distillation. Again, the cuts, we're looking for that elegance in the spirit. We're not looking for getting it as peaty as we can. We're not looking to recover as many phenols as we possibly can in the distillation. We get what we get, but focus, mainly on the purity of the spirit and the quality of that spirit to begin with. When we're filling the cask, again, laying those down, again, first of all, bourbon cask, looking for that vanilla, that influence, that sweetness that we get. Again, in the spirit, we've got a lot of fruit, we've got a lot of kind of stewed apple, a lot of kind of ripe pear notes, and kind of gooseberry in the spirit. And watching that develop, watching the peat develop and change in the cask is fascinating. We're going to add. Use quite a lot of French oak in there as well, maybe some second fill French oak to really kind of bring through some kind of more toasted notes, maybe some more kind of coffee chocolate notes coming through there as well, all of which are going to work beautifully with those phenols. In terms of the Octomore, what we're again really doing with that is we're kind of looking to get as much peat in there as we can in the malt. And that's kind of the conversation of the challenge with the guys up at Beds every year is, let's keep it above 80, but let's push it, let's see what we can do. And as everyone else has described, it's really, you're wrestling with a lot of different factors. And so we get this variation in what Octomore is. But when we come to Octomore, it's always been a bit of a challenge. And I think initially it was very much about those phenol numbers, because we were pushing up the boundary, trying to get as peat as we could. And when we would get the analysis from Beds, and we'd send samples away, get independently analysed, and we'd look at those numbers, and it was just incredible. And that was very much the conversation around what we were doing, and building that story around Octomore as being super heavy peated. But over the last 20 years of distilling it, or kind of 2002, the first year we distilled Octomore, so almost 20 years of distillation, that conversation, that our learning, our understanding of that spirit is really changing. So bottle Octomore, usually very young, at high strength, so it's around about 60% alcohol for an Octomore release. It is a vintage release, so it's not mixed in with other vintages. It is kind of one product of one batch. It's a really unique kind of moment each time, and by bottling that, by saying that this is a 5-year-old whiskey, it's super heavy peated. It is, it's a challenge, I suppose, to whiskey drinkers to kind of to open up the conversation around actually, it's about peat, but it's also about the distillation, as again we've all talked about. It's also about the casks. It's about all of the different components coming together, so that most people would think that the high strength whiskey at say 149 ppm, at 5 years old, just isn't a good recipe for a great whiskey. Actually, if you think about that, the quality of the barley we're using, we think about the flavors we're going to get from the peat, we think of long fermentation, we think of slow distillation, think about the quality of the cask we're using. Actually, just tasting that whiskey and it opens up. So I think our way of talking about peated whiskey has really changed as we're, again, experiencing it ourselves, as we're developing that ourselves. And for me, that I remember one of the first trips I ever did, I went to a whiskey fair in Oslo in Norway, and it was fantastic. As soon as the doors opened, everybody was running in, and these guys, the Scandinavians, they love the peated whiskey, and they were straight into the Octomore, and it was, it was a challenge. It was all about the peat level and how peaty is this one, and coming away from that and actually thinking, there's people being surprised that actually there was elegance to that spirit. It's really helped our understanding of peated whiskey by saying that it's not just about the peat, it's the whole package. And as I say, it's really refreshing and really interesting to listen to Rachel and to Colin talking about that as well, that it's every single aspect of what makes whiskey unique. And again, we're all working with the same ingredients, different techniques and different experiences. We can all create such amazing whiskey, but it takes it in such different directions.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for me, that's part of the joy. I think, dare I say it, don't be fooled by my American accent. My first love is Scotch, and I truly do believe that Scotch whiskey brings the greatest variety of flavors and aromas across the global whiskey world. Hopefully, I have not made too many enemies by saying that statement. But I'll go to, so just based around what you said there, Adam, which also touches into what Rachel was talking about. So I'd like to put a more clear distinction on some vocabulary, shall we say. And I am going to kick it to Rachel for this, just because she was using so much, or Rachel, you were using so much the word smoke rather than the word sort of peated or phenols. Could you, given you work as a blender, could you give a little bit of explanation of what you see as the difference between, though there is a lot of overlap, peat and smoke, and how you therefore approach the whiskeys that you create?
Well, peats we don't use actually in the food in making whiskey in terms of the flavor. It has no flavor. Peat has no flavor. Maybe it's earth. If you were to taste it, it would just be like earth. It has no flavor. So it's only when the peat is burned that it gives you flavor. And I think a lot of people, when you talk about peaty whiskey, they're thinking about the peat they put in their garden. They're thinking, well, it must be really earthy, or, oh, that sounds a bit bitter. However, with especially the new Benriach range, the 10 and the 12-year-old have actually called them the Smoky 10, the Smoky 12, because when the peat is burned, what you get is this wonderful aromatic smoke. It's like standing in a forest with a campfire and you are baking fruits over that campfire, drizzled in caramel and demerara sugar. It's sweet. So for me, the smokiness, it was actually kind of some experience I had in Kentucky when I was, with barbecued food, and even here I love barbecues. That smokiness, like of a smoky barbecue sauce, and what you have in that is really, really sweet. It's the sweet glycols, as I call them, that you get from wood, from maturation, and also when you burn the Speyside peat. So it's really, really sweet and really smoky. So that's what sets Benriach apart. I've described Benriach as being delicate genius, as being like the Sammy Davy Jr. song, the rhythm of life. It just kind of dances on your tongue. With the smoky notes, it's like added layers of flavor. It just adds a little bit of bass into that tune. It rounds things off, and it gives you a little bit more body and mouthfeel as well. But yeah, every single distillery is different, and peat. I think more people get smoke than get peat. So I'm thinking, as a consumer here, I can't think of anything else apart from the peat that I buy from the garden centre that actually has the word peat in it. If you think about foods that you buy all over the world, from Kentucky to Scotland, with smoked fish or whatever, smoked cheese. It's more similar to those sorts of flavors. Like a smoked apple would, for example, or, the Smoky 10 has that sort of character. So for me, it's about the character of the distillery, which is a fruit bomb. It's an apple orchard, apples and pears, and oranges and lemons. And then you take that, you put it in the mixing bowl with the smoke, and you bake it in a wood smoked oven. It's a bit like having a fruit pizza and then putting it in a wood smoke pizza oven and giving you that wonderful sweetness. So yeah.
Rachel,
Smoke is mostly the glycols that give you that lovely sweet smoke.
hopefully, Rachel, by talking about the virtues of fruit pizza, you've not put off the people who think that Hawaiian pizza is a sin on earth. I'm going to put one last question. So we're running out of time. I do have one last question that I'm going to put to all three of you. And it is a completely biased question from me. So we have heard the term throughout the chat today, ppm. So ppm, for those of you at home watching this, stands for, in the whiskey world, phenolic parts per million. And the general idea is that the higher the number, as Adam especially talked about with Percolati, the peatier the whiskey is going to be. Let me emphasize that, the peatier the whiskey is going to be. But as we also discussed, the way in which the distillation takes place and many other parts of the production process can change what comes through. But even today, ppm is still the term that, and now ppm is taken when after the malting process. So after you smoke the barley, you take the measurement, then you've got your fermentation, distillation, maturation process. So you actually, now there's some brands that do it, but not very many, that will talk about the SPPM, the phenolics in the spirit that then goes into the cask. But my question to you guys is, given where the measurement of peat is taken, how it's communicated to consumers, is ppm still a good number to use for consumers, or should the industry start moving away from that in some way? I put it to all three of you. Otherwise, and I am going to. Oh, sorry, go for it, Colin. Go for it. Sorry.
It's a really interesting point. I mean, I do tend to talk about ppm, but I think as an industry, I think sometimes it's easier just to talk about light peated, medium peated, heavily peated malt, because, like you say, it's all about flavor. You know, at the end of the day, it's either you like the whiskey, you don't. There's whiskies out there for everyone. And I think the people that are really into whiskey and understanding the process like to know what ppm you've mashed at. But I think overall, by talking like light, medium, or heavy, or super, or extra heavy in the terms of Octomore that Adam produces, you know, I think these sort of general terms tend maybe to be easier for people because, like you say, the ppm we talk about isn't the final spirit. It's not the unique spirit. You know, it's just what we've mashed in. So I think as an industry, when we, you know, recruit new customers or people who want to learn a wee bit more, then it's probably a good way to generalize. And then for people that are much more keen to learn the real ins and outs or technical aspects, then ppm probably still has a place.
Yeah, if I can pick up on that, I think for ourselves, certainly with Octomore, when we started bottling that, and I suppose, you know, making it, we're having that conversation with the maltings in the industry. It was about the ppm, and it was about that number that we were starting with, and we were again kind of being really transparent in what we were doing. We always put that you know, as much information on the bottle or the tin as we can, so you've got your ppm, your age, your cask type, all that kind of stuff of that whiskey going there. But again, when we first started doing it, it was just that's what we start with in the malt, and I think, you know, that we kind of always made that kind of clear. That's what we start with, and I've always been willing to have that conversation. But I think that is quite in depth for a lot of whiskey drinkers. You know, that is quite a, you know, for want of a better term, a geeky. I use that in a very positive sense, a very geeky kind of way of thinking about it. And, you know, thinking about what we do in the future, again, as we've discussed here, and as this conversation actually is more and more relevant, you know, maybe 10, 15 years ago, this conversation wouldn't have been happening, you know, and I think it's great that it is. It actually makes us think, you know, we probably do need to look as an industry about, you know, like Colin said, maybe just focusing on the flavour profile, because exactly as I've said with Octomore, it's a challenge. If you look at that number, it's too peaty to drink. Actually, the balance, the elegance, the level of peat in that whiskey, when you taste it, you know, we lose about 2/3 of the phenols through that distillation process when we measure that new spirit. So it probably, you know, I think if we understand that figure we start with at the beginning is in the malt, and that's the beginning of the journey, and that makes sense. But maybe there's more information that we can give and more information that we can look at. And again, as Rachel says, we're adding phenols in from the cask as well. So actually, it's I don't know how you have this conversation out with the way we've done it, where it's taken an hour or so to discuss and get into all the in-depth. So we probably still haven't resolved anything, but it's a great problem to be able to kind of think about and the industry can look at how we keep it.
With that,
From my perspective.
Sorry, Rachel, I think we're slightly over. So Rachel, you're going to have to make it snappy.
Quick. Yeah, PPM's an oversimplification. You know, it's all about the distillery character. First and foremost, it's an added layer of flavor. And, you know, a lot of whiskies don't even say, which are smoky, don't even say smoke on the label. So, you know, if you're going to look for a smoky whiskey, look for one that says smoky. And with Benriach, you can tell on the foot label here if it's a trace, if it's an elegant smoke, if it's a rich smoke, intense smoke, it will tell you that on the label. So I think that's the most important thing, is that you get an indication from the tasting notes and from the label. And that's the way to be truly transparent about this.
Absolutely. With that, we are now out of time. I can't stress enough, thank you to all three of you. And I have to stress to the audience watching right now, we've truly had a chance to go into the minds of some incredible whiskey people. And I really appreciate everything that you shared today. I also have to emphasize all three distilleries, Ardbeg, Bruichladdich, Benriach, they're all absolutely glorious in radically different ways and in absolutely wonderful ways. There's also many, many other Scotch whiskey distilleries and other distilleries in general doing amazing work around peat and smoke. But just because they're the ones talking to me, I'll big up all three of them. So yeah, Ardbeg, Bruichladdich, Benriach, check them all out. And it's been such a pleasure. Thank you all three of you, really. And thank you to all of you future audience for watching. And hopefully I've done an okay job of handling the questions and the comments that may have been coming in a few months' time from now. Thank you very much. This has been Digging for Peat at Tales of the Cocktail. And yeah, bye everybody. Cheers and thank you so much.
Yeah.
Cheers.
Thanks everybody.